Welcome back, everyone, to episode 7 of Chasing Space. I'm your host, Brendan Swanick, coming at you with another episode. Super exciting to get one off the plate post-launch last week. It was super exciting to see you all visiting the podcast, interacting with the podcast, subscribing to the podcast, and excited to keep moving forward with this. Today we're going to talk about something that I'm sure has been all over your newsfeed, especially if you follow space news. It's extremely important in the context of space safety and safety decisions throughout the 50, 60 years of NASA's manned spaceflight history, and that is going to be the Boeing Starliner. We're not here to talk about the news of Starliner. We're more here to discuss the contextual history of Starliner and more broadly, manned space-rated vehicles. So let's start with the situation on Starliner. Then we're going to provide some context on the arena of bringing astronauts to space and crew capsules in general. And then we'll dive into some of the interesting technical, both pros and cons and differences between Dragon and Starliner. Starting with the context on Starliner, the Boeing Starliner, officially known as CST-100 Starliner, was intended to broaden the avenues of bringing crew to space. As of right now, the ISS Commercial Crew Program. But since 2010, the vehicle, like most difficult space hardware, has been plagued by setbacks and technical obstacles. This program began with a $92.3 million contract to develop the vehicle post-Space Shuttle era. So 2010, the last Space Shuttle mission was in 2011, so getting a year head start. Moving forward to 2014, NASA officially chose Boeing and awarded an additional $4.2 billion contract to complete and certify Starliner for crewed missions, mainly as a competitor for the SpaceX Dragon, which we'll touch on a little bit later in this episode. The contract itself consisted of bringing at least one crewed flight test with at least one NASA astronaut on board. Moving forward to 2019, 5 years later, the Starship embarked on its first uncrewed orbital flight test, known as OFT-1. However, they had a series of different software malfunctions, and due to that, the spacecraft was unable to reach the ISS, resulting in a premature re-entry to Earth. Despite the hiccups, the landing was deemed successful and demonstrated the re-entry capabilities of the vehicle, which is a unique note to remember for the end of the episode. Following an independent review, Boeing was given 80 recommendations to be addressed before their next flight attempt. Fast forwarding another 2 years to August 3rd, 2021, we're now 11 years after the initial contract award. The second OFT-2 was delayed due to a valve issue in the spacecraft's propulsion system. After several more delays, some related to hardware, some related to more administrative setbacks, the new date was set for May 22 launch, which in the time did successfully launch, dock, and re-enter. The positives was that this capsule carried approximately 245 kilograms of cargo to the International Space Station. However, from a fiscal perspective, due to the original fixed-price contract award in 2014, Boeing did have to front an additional $410 million out of pocket to make this happen. This was launched on an Atlas V vehicle. Diving into this mission a little bit more, 31 minutes into it, the Starliner inserted into orbit, and then at this point, 2 out of the 12 OMAC thrusters in the service module failed upon ignition. This triggered the onboard flight control system to switch to backup thrusters and complete the burn. After that, 2 reaction control system thrusters also malfunctioned but were recovered. In both cases, Boeing publicly said that the vehicle had sufficient redundancy to continue the mission, and on top of that, the spacecraft also encountered problems with the thermal control loop early in the mission. I don't say this to hate on Boeing. I say this because it's important to recognize the context of developing these really difficult manned space flight capsules and all the different design hiccups that happened along the way. Boeing originally modified the design of the Starliner docking system after the OFT-1 flight, which included adding a hinged re-entry cover below the expendable nose cone for additional protection during the capsule's fiery descent through the atmosphere, similar to the one used in the SpaceX Dragon 2 nose cone. This hardware was tested on the OFT-2 mission, and this flight also marked the first time that a spacecraft with NASA's docking system docked to the ISS. For context, Dragon's docking system was designed internally by SpaceX themselves. So, long story short, the OFT-2 vehicle was able to launch, dock for 6 days, and re-enter safely, which certified the vehicle for a crewed flight test. Which brings us to more recent history. These Boeing Starliners do get a bad rap, but many of the issues were similar to those experienced during the Demo 1 mission of SpaceX Dragon, which is not including the testing issues Demo 1 faced in 2019 when one of their test articles was destroyed when firing due to its Super Draco engines at a landing zone 1. Back to Starliner. In June of 2022, we're starting to get prepared for this crewed flight test, certified by this OFT-2 flight that we just talked about. And now we're getting some words about astronauts. So the astronauts that will be on this flight are going to be Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams. I'm sure you've heard their names before at this point. This is good news. We're selecting astronauts for moving forward. The bad news is that the following summer, when the Starliner program then experienced an indefinite delay, mainly due to the issues with the parachute system carrying less load than expected, as well as the flammable tape in the wiring harness. So that was all one issue, parachute system as well as the wiring harness. And then between then, May and June of 2024, the launch was aborted several times for a series of reasons, some due to valve issues on the ULA rocket itself. One actually was an abort at the very last second due to a helium leak. Not sure if anyone was watching with their fingers crossed at the edge of their seat like I was. That was deemed a minor issue at the time, and it was later traced back to one of the system control thrusters used for maneuvering in low Earth orbit, or LEO. Finally, on its third attempt, the crewed flight test Boeing Starliner with Butch and Suni launched on June 5th, 2024 of this year, with an anticipated return on June 14th. So to begin the saga that has been covered all over the news, initially, it was widely misrepresented, and that was mainly because A, we didn't know what was going on, and B, telling the public that there's astronauts stuck in space makes for a much better thumbnail than knowing that we have some technical issues that are undetermined to be solved at the moment. So this whole saga began with almost derailing the docking, right? As soon as Starliner was attempting the docking, there was some thruster delays and thruster issues, and also introduced a couple of new minor helium leaks during the ride to station. So they're on station now. This is 9 days after their arrival. They're supposed to stay for 8 days. And then the undocking date was then pushed back to June 2022. And this was to review the spaceflight ops and procedures, right? We think we're trudging forward. We're all good. Then we get to June 22nd, and Boeing and NASA released a joint statement that the return is now, quoted, no return date, but not stranded. However, like I mentioned, as soon as the word stranded was mentioned, this was a perfect thumbnail for news outlets to latch onto, even though it wasn't necessarily the case at the time. We didn't really know what was going on, and we were still troubleshooting. And now, astronauts have been on there for close to 70 days at the time of this recording, and counting. The main reason why Starliner is still in orbit is due to troubleshooting and what happened during the docking, why they experienced issues with their propulsion system. To be specific, 5 out of 28 of their coal gas thrusters are not functioning properly. They wanted to test this on the ground, and they also wanted to test it in the best place to possibly test a coal gas thruster, which is in orbit. So in early July, the team took the exact thrusters on board the Starliner and conducted this testing at both the White Sands test facility in New Mexico and then on orbit, which gave the team more insight into actually what's happening. So one of the thrusters, specifically an Aerojet Rocketdyne test MR-104J thruster, which for context was in storage for a couple of years prior to this groundwork, experienced severe degradation in its valve system from nitrogen dioxide vapor. To dumb that down, essentially the flow is restricted due to a bulge in the seal, according to their engineering team. This is suggesting that erosion in the seal was due to the bubbling under high temperatures. And this behavior matched what's going on orbit. These thrusters have plenty of flight heritage, but did undergo some modifications for Starliner, which included surrounding each thruster with a quote-unquote doghouse, mainly to insulate and protect the thruster from the cold temperatures in space, which in turn actually ended up causing the thrusters to increase in temperature more than expected following both thruster pulses for their attitude determination and control system, ADCS, and their orbital maneuvering. So currently, overall, we're past the commercial flight test's initial limit of 45 days. However, their battery is rated for 90, which puts us at around September 3rd of a deadline. And this deadline, again, is soft. There's a lot of factor of safeties and variables that go into this that aren't necessarily reflected, but just for some context. At the time of this recording, the Starliner team plans to conduct test fires of the 28 thruster reaction control systems, noted the RCS. However, one thruster was already deemed unusable for the flight home, so one of the 28. The two astronauts will also be joining the testing, most likely due to their experience as Navy test pilots in their past, which would be a pretty cool experience. Not in the context, but, generally cool. They will also get a chance to look at the helium system, which has not been analyzed in 6 weeks, back to June 15th. So fingers crossed. This is the latest that we have of what's going on. There's more information coming out every day that's been involved with bringing these astronauts to the station for a long time. And right now, the only two technically viable from the United States in order to bring them back to Earth is the Dragon and the Starliner. So let's talk a little bit about the context on what these capsules are, how they're rated, what is a manned capsule, and who is bringing people to space at the moment, who's bringing people to the International Space Station. So this all began with the NASA Space Shuttle program.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. We've gone for main engine start. We have. Come on, baby. Go! Oh, honey, go. Fly like an eagle. Go.
This program is technically known as the Space Transportation System and was the first U.S. vehicle to bring astronauts to space beginning in 1981. NASA built 5 shuttles, which conducted over 135 missions between 1981 and then sunset in 2011. The shuttle was a complete monster. If you have a chance to see one in person, I highly suggest it. The two that I've seen is down at the Udvar-Hazy Center at Washington, D.C.'s Smithsonian Air and Space Museum out near Dulles Airport, and then the other one down at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Center, the Atlantis shuttle, which is beautifully displayed with the payload doors open. You won't believe the size of these things if you have not seen one in person. As I was saying, a complete monster. 7 crew members, 2 decks, including an airlock and a massive cargo bay, and largely responsible for the construction of the International Space Station on orbit. Unfortunately, as many of you know, 2 of the shuttles, the Challenger and the Columbia, were both destroyed. One during launch and one during re-entry, which killed all 7 astronauts on each mission, which left a significant legacy of NASA's deeply rooted safety culture. Shifting over to our partners on the International Space Station, Russia. Before and after the shuttle, until today, Russia utilized the Soyuz vehicle as its ISS workhorse, with capacity for both cargo and crewed missions. This vehicle began flying in 1967 after retirement of the Russian Voskhod vehicle. Obviously, the Soyuz capsules flying today are not identical to those flying in the 1960s. And the USSR and Russia have developed over 10 iterations of the Soyuz modules. Not including every iteration individually, the Soyuz spacecraft have made over 150 crewed flights. Interestingly, from a geopolitics perspective, if you think about the time frame, starting in the 1960s, this vehicle is also widely considered to be the marker of the end of the Cold War in 1975, when it was docked with the U.S.-led Apollo Command module. Very fascinating history, and we have an episode in the near future talking a little bit about the geopolitics during that time, specifically in the space regime. This vehicle has a fascinating heritage dating all the way back to the Salyut and the Mir stations, and then all the way forward to the International Space Station. Between the end of the shuttle program in 2011 and the beginning of the commercial era, NASA astronauts have caught rides to the station along with their international colleagues, which has been really fantastic to witness. Welcome to the commercial era. Following 8 years of just Soyuz, after the final ride of the shuttle in 2011, the award was given to both SpaceX and Boeing in 2010 to develop a commercial vehicle to enable United States astronauts to fly to the ISS from their own domestic soil. SpaceX was the first one to enter the game with their vehicle, the Dragon 1.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA, go SpaceX, Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
America has launched. And so rises a new era of American spaceflight, and with it the ambitions of a new generation continuing the dream. 20 seconds into flight, stage 1 propulsion is nominal.
The Dragon 1 was funded by the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program, and it flew 23 cargo missions between 2010 and 2020. These were all commercial resupply missions to the International Space Station. A huge leap forward from the shuttle era. After, a new and improved version of the Dragon 2, was introduced in 2019, with a use case for both crewed and cargo missions. Following the Demo 1, which I mentioned earlier in this episode, an uncrewed certification mission, it was followed by the first primary ferry-to-fly crew to and from the ISS in May of 2020, which truly changed the game for commercial space and will forever be a staple, which truly revealed the trust and, quite frankly, the reliance of NASA on the commercial industry. Last but not least, this brings us to the Starliner.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. And liftoff of Starliner and Atlas V, carrying 2 American heroes, drawing a line to the stars for all of us.
We already chatted about the Starliner, so I'll spare you from repeating all those technical details. But I do think it's interesting to chat about the differences between the Dragon and the Starliner, because right now, those are the only 2 vehicles from the United States that are certified to fly crew to the International Space Station and orbit in general. So, many of these statistics were pulled from a variety of different sources. However, for some more digestible information, I recommend checking out Tim Dodd's article called How SpaceX and Boeing Will Get Astronauts to the ISS for more in-depth technical details. From my research, here are the highlights. Starting with Starliner, it is designed for a capacity of 7 seats, but NASA typically won't use more than 4. Same with the Crew Dragon, same with the shuttle. The capsule has a diameter of 15 feet, which is slightly larger than the Apollo command module, but smaller than the Orion capsule that's designed to go much further in space for the Artemis missions. The Starliner can remain docked to the ISS for 7 months, and the cockpit features a traditional layout, which is on brand for Boeing, but the positives is that it offers familiar control interfaces for astronauts, similar to legacy vehicles that they have most likely already flown on, like the shuttle. It is up in the air if this was a deliberate decision or not, but this is the case. Starliner is capable of delivering up to 5,500 pounds of pressurized cargo and 3,300 pounds of unpressurized cargo. On to the SpaceX Dragon. So the Dragon consists of a reusable capsule with an integrated trunk designed for low Earth orbit missions. The capsule has a diameter of 13 feet, slightly smaller than the Starliner, but it's also able to hold a crew of up to 7 people, as I mentioned. This can also remain docked for 7 months. Their cockpit is very different Think of the inside of a Tesla. Features modern touchscreens and minimal physical controls. In terms of cargo, the Dragon is capable of delivering up to 13,000 pounds of combined pressurized and unpressurized cargo. This also includes the trunk, which in my case was known for delivering the Bishop airlock, which is a commercial airlock on the International Space Station 2 station several years ago. There are currently 4 Dragon vehicles in use. These are named the Endeavour, Resilience, Endurance, and Freedom. And since 2020, the Crew Dragon alone has launched 13 crewed flights to space, 9 for NASA to the ISS, and 4 commercial companies with commercial customers. Since 2020, the Crew Dragon alone has launched 13 crewed flights to space, 9 for NASA with NASA astronauts and those alike to the ISS, and 4 commercial customers. One notably that I'm sure you've seen in the news is the Axiom Private Astronaut Missions, or PAM missions. At the time of this recording, the most recent was AX-3, led by MLA. It's also important to note that we have not seen the full deployed use of Starliner. We haven't seen the full crewed flight tests come to a close. Again, this is open, and we'll see what happens in the coming months to see if we can see a reentry with crew on board. Another interesting vehicle that's in play right now and in development and actually getting close to launch is the Sierra Space Dream Chaser. This is a new player in the commercial resupply team. The main design, if you have not seen pictures of it yet, I highly recommend it. Sierra Space has done a fantastic job of documenting its build throughout the whole process on all of their social medias, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. The design was comprised from the NASA HL-20 Personal Launch System spaceplane. This concept was studied by NASA's Langley Research Center in the 1990s, which also was inspired by the Soviet BO-4S orbital rocket plane from the 70s and 80s. I'll stop there because obviously, as you can see, designs inform future designs, and history does not change too much, and there's going to be a future episode talking all about space planes, what the past looked like, and the future looked like. We'll go back to Dream Chaser. As I said, this is developed by Sierra Space, an American reusable lifting body spaceplane paying homage to the space shuttle and originally intended to be a crewed vehicle following the Dream Chaser cargo system variant. Dream Chaser began as quote-unquote a dream in 2004 with the company Space Dev, and a series of acquisitions later landed in the hands of the Sierra Space Corporation. Dream Chaser will be used to supply the ISS, launch vertically on a Vulcan Centaur rocket, and land horizontally and autonomously on conventional runways. Just for fun, and because this is interesting, in terms of propulsion, the unit will consist of a pressure-fed 3-mode engine. So at low and mid-power regimes, it uses hydrogen peroxide, a monopropellant fuel, and at high power, it will also add an injection of RP-1 fuel. The main use case of this fuel in this high-power mode is to shorten the burn duration of the vehicle. Dream Chaser will also have a cargo module, coined the Shooting Star, which is a 15-foot-long module capable of carrying an additional 10,000 pounds of pressurized and unpressurized cargo to the ISS. One final fact that I'll throw at you all, which is pretty important and interesting, is the port size. Dream Chaser has a unique one. Let's take the Node 3 hatch opening on the ISS, for example. So Node 3 is a 50-inch by 50-inch, think square. It's not that simple, but we'll think a square for now. This opening at the maximum of all the computer panel assays are removed from the sides, which would require crew time to remove, right? So not very big, essentially a 4-by-foot square maximum. The SpaceX Dragon matches these dimensions. The Boeing Starliner matches these dimensions, but Dream Chaser peculiarly has a hatch opening of 38 inches by 44 inches. It's elliptical, which is pretty interesting. Between all of these different crewed vehicles, whether we're talking about the shuttle, the Roscosmos Soyuz, the crewed flight test from Boeing, the Demo 2 launch, the SpaceX, all of these different tests, vehicles, we have to take a step back, regardless of the news, and just remind ourselves how incredible it is and is going to be to have 3 commercial companies potentially bringing astronauts to both the ISS and future commercial stations. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in this episode. I hope you learned a little bit about what's going on both in the news and the context of why this is such a critically important moment in manned space flight history, and the legacy that these safety decisions in the next couple of months will leave on our space program in the decades to come. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love if you can leave a 5-star rating and review. You can find this on any podcast player of your choosing, whether that's Apple Music, Spotify, or whatever you prefer. Thank you so much again for listening. This is Chasing Space with Brendan Swanwick. Looking forward to chatting with you all next week.